A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East.
Failed diplomacy saves millions of lives. Why the USA used the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, the United States of America dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. Then, 3 days later, on August 9th, the U.S. dropped another bomb on Nagasaki, killing thousands but saving millions. Because both the Allies and the Japanese were unwilling to compromise on the terms of surrenders presented in the Potsdam Declaration, diplomacy failed to end the war. The Japanese would not have surrendered without millions of casualties on both sides without the use of the atomic bombs. The atomic bombs would forever impact the way war is waged and how negotiations, both internal and external, are conducted. Because of events like the Saipan Banzai attack, and the documented statements of American military planners in 1945 to the effect that the entire population of Japan is a proper military target. There are no civilians in Japan. I believe Japan would not have surrendered in World War II without the use of the atomic bomb. A major reason for this belief is Operation Ketsugo, the official battle plan of the Japanese imperial forces to defend the mainland islands, and whose underlying premise was to shatter what Japan believed to be brittle American morale by defeating the invasion or inflicting such abhorrent and appalling casualties that the Americans' will to continue the war would evaporate. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, Vice Chief of Japanese Naval Operations, said, "If we are prepared to sacrifice 20 million Japanese lives, victory will be ours." Japanese were prepared to fight to the death before the dishonor of surrender. At the end of the war, the Japanese had approximately 12,700 aircraft and were prepared to launch these in waves of 300 to 400 per hour in kamikaze attacks used extensively at Okinawa as the Allied forces neared. They had hidden stockpiles of suicide weapons all over Japan and anticipated support for the looming invasion. Besides the kamikaze suicide planes, they had also manufactured Shinyo suicide boats, motorboats with up to 660 pounds of explosive attached to the front. And, like the kamikaze aircraft, these boats were used to ram into Allied ships or landing craft, destroying them and killing the soldiers aboard. Another weapon in the Japanese arsenal was the Kai-10 submarine. These submarines were essentially torpedoes with a man inside to guide them into enemy ships. The Japanese were also preparing Fukuryu divers, which were often called human mines or suicide divers by Allied troops. These divers had 16-foot bamboo poles with mines attached to the end. They would hold the mines in front of the landing craft to destroy them. All of these weapons had already seen action in battles like Okinawa and Iwo Jima and were a big part of the plan for Operation Ketsugo. Unlike previous battles, like Okinawa, where the Japanese allowed Allied forces to come ashore and then would shoot them down, the main goal of Operation Ketsugo was to stop the Allied forces before they landed. In late 1944, initial casualty expectations for Allied forces during the invasion of mainland Japan were around 100,000 troops. But as the Allied forces battled their way across the Pacific through fighting on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, they learned that as they neared the Japanese mainland, the Japanese fighting became more ferocious and tenacious, and correspondingly, the casualty expectations went up for the mainland invasion. In June of 1945, approximately 350,000 Japanese soldiers were ready for battle on Kyushu, the most southern of the mainland islands. By the end of the war in September, just 3 months later, They were closer to 900,000 troops prepared to fight to the death to defend their home islands. On the day of Japan's surrender, the Imperial Japanese forces numbered 6,983,000 men. Of that, 3,532,000 were on the Japanese mainlands. Additionally, the civilian population, approximately 18 to 20 million males and females between the ages of 15 and 60, were also conditioned and prepared to fight to the end along with the Imperial soldiers as they had done on Saipan. The Japanese even went as far as training their own children to strap dynamite around their waists and in attacks known as Sherman carpets, dive under Sherman tank treads, blowing themselves and the tank up. Not only were the Japanese military and civilian populations prepared to fight to the death, but the Japanese were prepared to use chemical warfare to help minimize their casualties and increase the enemy casualty rates. As the Allies neared the Japanese mainland, the defenders became more desperate and were willing to attempt anything to save their honor. And when all else failed, they were willing to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, rather than surrender. Even after dropping the atomic bombs, many Japanese would not accept the dishonor of surrendering and committed seppuku. Operation Ketsugo was the plan to defend Japan. The Allied invasion plan, overall known as Operation Downfall, was the plan to defeat Japan, and although the estimated casualty numbers are still debated today, in July 1945, the U.S. War Department estimated that the total U.S. casualties would be between 1.7 and 4 million, with 400 to 800,000 deaths, and total Japanese civilian deaths would range from 5 to 10 million. The first phase of Operation Downfall included Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu. Operation Olympic planned for the landing of about 766,000 troops on Kyushu, with U.S. casualties initially estimated to be 234,000, 94,000 dead, and 140,000 wounded. The plan was to weaken the Japanese fortifications with everything possible. As with other invasions in the Pacific theater, planes from islands and aircraft carriers would first bomb the fortifications, and then the nearby battleships would fire upon the fortifications to further weaken them. Once the landings had been softened, the troops would land in several places and press forward to take Kyushu. Once this was completed, the Allies would move on to the main island of Honshu. Using intelligence operations, the Allies would try to convince the Japanese that Korea or the island of Shikoku were the next targets, so they would divert resources to those areas, helping minimize Allied casualties. However, American war planners knew that fighting on the main islands would be a grueling and bloody process. At the end of July 1945, President Truman was attending the Potsdam Conference when he learned of the successful detonation of the atomic bomb. Diplomacy with Japan failed when they refused the Potsdam Declaration, calling for unconditional surrender, leaving President Truman four options: continue the conventional bombing of Japanese cities, invade Japan, demonstrate the atomic bomb on an unpopulated island, or drop the atomic bomb on an inhabited Japanese city. Knowing the U.S. War Department's estimates of millions of casualties on both sides during an invasion, and the demonstrated Japanese unwillingness to surrender, President Truman made the difficult decision to kill thousands and save millions.